Starting to get through a ton of 2025 fantasy football drafts as well as 2025 fantasy football mock drafts. And I'm noticing, I think there are some really good value running backs that are just being overlooked as we approach the upcoming fantasy football season. So let's break down 5 running backs who may be incredible values where they're being drafted at, or at least are just being a little bit overlooked. Let's start with Breeland Hall of the New York Jets, who's currently sitting at an ADP of 34.3 on the Sleeper app, coming off of a disappointing season, to say the least, where he finished as the RB16 after a sophomore season where he was the RB2 overall in fantasy football drafts. So, Breeland Hall's ADP last year was in the top 5 in almost every single fantasy football draft that we got through in August time. And last year was just beyond disappointing. But we look at things a little bit closer. I mean, Breeland Hall still had a good season when we break it down. He only gave you single-digit fantasy performances 5 times last year. He averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game. It just wasn't quite there in terms of upside, and some of the upside that we had seen in previous seasons, at least in the sophomore season. One of the biggest things was he had 95 targets, 76 catches in his sophomore season. Then last year, 76 targets, 57 receptions. That sophomore season was so impressive because we had that, Frankenstein room of quarterbacks come out after the Aaron Rodgers injury. And, that ended up being a really good thing for Breeland Hall because we got a lot of those dump offs and whatnot. And that ended up being a very positive thing for Breeland Hall's fantasy value in 2023, especially towards the end of the season, right? But nonetheless, like I said, last year, it felt awful, especially where you drafted Breeland Hall, but he was still the RB16, so a top 16 fantasy football running back last year. We just didn't get a massive amount of upside. But like I said, it didn't actually turn out to be the worst fantasy season in the world. It just felt like it because we drafted him so early last year, right? And now there's kind of like even more of a negative buzz on Breeland Hall going into next year because we have Justin Fields as a starting quarterback for the Jets. But I think that could actually be a good thing for Breeland Hall. A lot of people worried here because Justin Fields, known to be a run-first quarterback, but I think we're just going to get kind of like a run-first offense out of the Jets, and I think that's going to be a good thing for Breeland Hall and the way he's utilized within this offense. But outside of that, we've had trade rumors about Breeland Hall. Like, there's always some sort of injury concern around Breeland Hall, and then we had moments last year where backup running backs Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis were both implemented into this offense, right? And this is kind of going to be a theme throughout this video, right? Like, a lot of people kind of freak out whenever we start to get coach speak about RB2s, RB3s on rosters, committee backfield type situations. But there are plenty of committee backfields that, still result in RB1s being perfectly fine in fantasy. So don't get me wrong here. I'm personally not freaking out about like some of Aaron Glenn's comments about utilizing Isaiah Davis and Braylon Allen. And, we do have Breeland Hall going into the 4th year of his contract, which is another thing that like some people freak out about. But I personally don't think it's a bad thing when a running back or any player is going into the 4th year or final year of their contract, because that just gives the coaching staff even more reason to utilize that player and run them into the ground, which is something that we definitely see with the running back position. So I understand that there's some writing on the wall here that's not entirely positive for Breeland Hall, but I also won't personally be surprised if the talent that Breeland Hall is just takes over and we end up getting a super solid season out of Breeland Hall and an even better season than we got last year. Right now, his ADP is pretty appropriate at 34.3 for finishing as the RB16 last year. I do think he could end up being really sneaky and end up being a player who reminds us why he was the RB2 in 2023. All right, next up, let's talk about David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions, who finished last year as the RB18 overall and is going at an ADP of 55.1 currently on the Sleeper app. David Montgomery is a player who, like, I feel like I'm drafting almost every single draft that I come out of right now. Monty was on an absolute tear last year before getting injured. He had one single-digit fantasy performance game last year, not including the game against Buffalo in Week 15, in which he had his season-ending injury. Every other game last year, he had 12.6 or more fantasy points. He had 12 rushing touchdowns on the season. There was a good stretch of last season where him and Gibbs were like neck and neck in terms of fantasy rankings overall. Gibbs had a fantastic season, but Gibbs also really benefited in those last couple weeks where there was no David Montgomery. Jahmyr Gibbs, 28.4 fantasy points in week 15, 25.4 in week 16, 26.3 in week 17. To give you an idea of that, those were his three highest fantasy totals on the entire season. He only had over 20 fantasy points three other times last year. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Gibbs is the upside player here, right? Like, I'm not in any way discrediting Jahmyr Gibbs in any way. You know, he was a top 3 fantasy football running back last year for a reason. He was a top 10 fantasy football running back in his rookie year for a reason. And like, now we have the departure of Ben Johnson. You know, the writing is on the wall here, right? David Montgomery is age 28. Jahmyr Gibbs is age 23. I get it, but I think right now where Monty is going in drafts, coming off of a season that he was still incredibly highly productive, I just think he's being a little bit overlooked. I don't see any, you know, in any way, shape, or form why David Montgomery just would not be a part of this offense anymore, even with Ben Johnson departing as the offensive coordinator. You know, he's under contract with the Lions. They're going to utilize him. They're going to make him part of this offense. Could he drop back a little bit? Absolutely. I mean, Gibbs at this point in his career should be close to almost completely taking over this backfield, but I just don't think that there's any reason why they wouldn't try to keep Gibbs, you know, as fresh as possible throughout the season, especially if they are going to make another playoff push. So for me, I think Monty's ADP is absolutely great. I think that Gibbs deserves to be going where Gibbs is going in mock drafts 110%. But I think Monty's just being a little bit overlooked. And this is one thing that happens year to year in fantasy is recency biases. So see Monty like fall off at the end of the year because he was hurt. He was not, you know, in any way, shape, or form good in the playoff game against the Commanders. He had 7 rushes for 28 rushing yards, but that was also a game where the game script quickly turned into a throw the football first type of game script for the Lions. But yeah, I think Monty, fantastic last year overall, paid off at his ADP last year. I think it's going to pay off at his ADP once again as we go into 2025. So let's talk about Tyrone Tracy of the New York Giants, currently sitting at an ADP of 78.1 on the Sleeper app. And I think Tyrone Tracy is a very interesting player to look at right now. I feel like his draft stock completely has just dropped because the Giants went out and drafted Cam Scatterbo. But I don't think that Scatterbo is just going to come in here and take away all of the touches. I like Scatterbo as much as the next guy, but I don't know if he is a true 3-down back in the NFL. I think he's going to have a good role in this offense. I won't be surprised if he turns into a 3-down back necessarily, but I think his skill set will be a little bit more utilized in the red zone, which of course could be negative for Tyrone Tracy. But the point being here is that I think Scatterbo is the RB2 and he's going to fight for the RB2 position. I think that Tyrone Tracy, based on what he did last year, is the RB1 right now on the roster for the Giants. And don't get me wrong, Tyrone Tracy was a little bit up and down last year. He took over the backfield after that injury to Devin Singletary in week 4, and it wasn't always particularly consistent. His first 2 weeks getting the rock consistently were very good with 14 points in week 5, 22.7 in week 6. Then there were some ups and downs. There were some bad fumbles, but wasn't like that crazy. Those 2 really bad fumbles, including the game losing one in week 10 against Carolina, and then a really bad one in week 12 after the bye week in week 11 against the Buccaneers as well. But, you know, ultimately 5 fumbles, 2 lost on the season is not great, but is also not the worst thing in the world. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's not like the Giants offense was firing on all cylinders last year as well. So he averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game, but we have to remember like the first 4 games of the season, that's included in there. And he didn't have more than 5 rushing attempts in any of those games. So, you know, I think that Tyrone Tracy is just one of these running backs who's kind of like not being looked at as the starter. But I think right now, until further notice, he is the starter. Could Scatterbo take over? Sure. I mean, in theory, any RB2 could take over the starting position. And I guess there's some bad writing on the wall for Tyrone Tracy. Like, he's a little bit older. He's age 25 going into his sophomore season. So he's not a great dynasty asset, maybe. But in redraft, like, I'm not freaking out here. I think he's a starting running back. I think that this offense improved in the offseason. The quarterback play is going to be better, right? And, ultimately, I think that Tyrone Tracy is just being overlooked where he's currently being drafted with an ADP of 78.1. So this is another running back late in your drafts that I feel like I'm leaving a lot of drafts with currently because I think he is a great overall value. We'll see what happens 2025. All right, next up, we have Najee Harris of the LA Chargers. This is probably, arguably, my favorite player on today's list in terms of ADP, at least. He's currently sitting at an ADP of 85.5 on Sleeper, coming off of a season where he was the RB20. It just feels like no matter what Najee Harris does, everybody absolutely hates him. Okay. Averaged 12 fantasy points per game last year. Is it great? No. Is there upside? Not really. But is it bad? No. Like, I mean, if you can get 10 plus points, 12-ish points on a regular basis, that is a running back that you can trust as an RB2 in bad situations, injuries, things like that, bye weeks, and a worst case scenario, and running back that you can throw into the flex, right? Average 11.5 fantasy points in 2023, average 13.2 in 2022. You know, he's had over 1,000 rushing yards in every single one of his seasons and 6 or more touchdowns in every single one of his seasons. We obviously saw, you know, at moments some touches of Jaylen Warren last year, but Najee Harris was the better running back for the Steelers all year long last year. And, you know, I love Omarion Hampton. I think he is very close to being the best running back in this rookie draft class. Obviously, Genty is the best running back in this rookie draft class, but if there was no Genty, Hampton would have been the best rookie running back in this draft class, no doubt about it in my mind. And I like Omarion Hampton as much as the next guy. I understand why he goes higher in drafts, all that stuff. But this is a run-first offense. This is an offense that's going to run the football a ton. They're going to utilize both of these running backs. Najee Harris is not just going to be complete dust, completely forgotten about. He's going to have a role in this Chargers offense. I guarantee it. And I think one thing that happens, you know, a lot in the offseason, right, is like we just kind of have these preconceived notions of backfields and what's going to happen, especially when there's a rookie running back implemented. You could think like Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker, and, you know, a lot of people like being down on Kenneth Walker after Charbonnet was drafted. And then in, you know, Charbonnet's rookie season, he basically did next to nothing. Think back to last year, like James Conner's done. Trey Benson's on the Cardinals. Wasn't even a thing. James Conner was the primary running back all year long for the Cardinals last year, right? And I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen here. Like, Hampton is a much higher, you know, graded prospect than both Benson and even Charbonnet, right? But sometimes we just get really disappointed when we're going out and we're drafting some of these rookie running backs really high. And then, you know, the first 6 weeks of the season, you know, the veteran ends up getting all the touches still, right? You know, NFL coaches and GMs, they don't necessarily think exactly the way that fantasy football managers think, right? And we want all the upside and all the hype and all this stuff, and it just doesn't always happen. You know, another example this year is like, I like Trayvon Henderson as much as the next guy. Don't get me wrong. I think he could easily take over that backfield. But I got a bad feeling like we're going to watch Ramondre Stevenson get the rock the first couple of weeks of the season at least. And I think there's other backfields, like the Steelers backfields with Caleb Johnson and Jaylen Warren, where that could lead to some disappointment at times as well. But getting back to the Chargers and on topic here, right, I think at the very least, Najee Harris, as long as he's healthy, is going to have a role in this offense, this Jim Harbaugh system. They want to run the football first and foremost. We mostly saw that last year, albeit Herbert was a little bit injured to start the year, had some early injuries as well. And I know there were times where they, you know, started to throw the football more, but ultimately this is a run the football first offense and play defense. Rely on those two things. There's going to be plenty of touches to go around. I think that Najee Harris, at the very worst, could end up just being the pure goal line back here. But where he's going in drafts with an ADP of 85.5, being a top 23 running back in the first 4 years of his season, being pretty dang efficient through the first 4 years of his season with 3.82 yards per carry or more. It's not great, but it's certainly not bad. I just think that Najee Harris is a really good value right now and a player who we need to keep a close eye on, because at the end of the day, I think he could end up having a lot more value than where he's currently being drafted in fantasy football drafts. And last but not least, let's talk about Taj Spears of the Tennessee Titans, currently going at an ADP of 117.2 on the Sleeper app. And listen, okay, I like Tony Pollard a lot. I think he's another running back who has tremendous value at his given ADP. Find myself drafting a lot of Tony Pollard, right? But I think that Taj Spears is one of the better handcuffs overall, if we just want to look at it from that perspective, but could also just be a player who has tremendous value at his ADP. This was a league winner last year. This was a waiver wire guy that absolutely helped you guys win fantasy playoff games last year and the fantasy championship, right? Wasn't fantastic in week 17, but was very good, but at least helped you get to week 17 with 27.2 fantasy points in week 15, 21.6 in week 16, and 13.3 in week 17. Yes, they played 3 bad defenses against the Bengals, the Colts, and the Jags to wrap up the season, but it doesn't matter. He was a league winner last year, and when he was given the opportunity last year and when he was healthy, he absolutely shined. Now, it's also worth noting that in weeks 15 and 16, Tony Pollard was active for those 2 games, and Spears was still the back that got the bulk of the carries there. But the main, knock against Taj Spears is the health concerns, right? He did play a full rookie season, but last year only played through 12 games, and then he has been dealing with concussion so far in the offseason. So there's injury concerns here, don't get me wrong, but I think that the upside is certainly there for Taj Spears. And, there were even some games earlier in the season, weeks 3 and 4, where he at least got you 10 and 11 fantasy points as well. He always has that pass catching upside. He's kind of just a different style of running back. And at the end of the day, this offense will be better this year. Will Levis is not the starting quarterback. We're not going to have a carousel of quarterbacks. We're going to have Cameron Ward as the starting quarterback here. Things will be improved here for guys like Tony Pollard, Taj Spears, Calvin Ridley. We have the addition of Tyler Lockett, as well as rookie Alec Manor, who I like a lot, and Xavier Respiro. And Chicken Conquo is still chugging around on this team as well. Always a deep sleeper at the tight end position, right? So I just like Taj Spears where he's going in drafts. This is a player that you don't have to spend a lot of draft capital on. He's a great overall handcuff, and I do think that he has standalone value when he's healthy as well. And like I said, I really like Tony Pollard. I think that Spears is just being overlooked at the end of the day and could be the running back on the Titans that ends up with the most upside as we enter 2025. And that'll do it for today's video. There are 5 running backs that I think are being overlooked as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long. Free fantasy football content, redraft, dynasty, and best ball. If you guys are into that, be sure to subscribe on the way out. But most importantly, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop me a comment down below. I'll answer every single comment on this video. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.